When Mozart passed away, he was buried in a churchyard. A couple days later, the town drunk was walking through the cemetery and heard some strange noise coming from the area where Mozart was buried. Terrified, the drunk ran and got the priest to come and listen to it. The priest bent close to the grave and heard some faint, unrecognizable music coming from the grave. Frightened, the priest ran and got the town magistrate. When the magistrate arrived, he bent his ear to the grave, listened for a moment and said, "Ah yes, that's Mozart's 9th Symphony being played backwards." He listened a while longer and said, "There's the 8th Symphony and it's backwards too." Most puzzling. So the magistrate kept listening. There's the 7th, the 6th, the 5th. Suddenly the realization of what was happening dawned on the magistrate. He stood up and announced to the crowd that had gathered in the cemetery, "My fellow citizens, there's nothing to worry about. It's just Mozart decomposing." A company, feeling it was time for a shake-up, hires a new CEO. This new boss is determined to rid the company of all slackers. On a tour of the facility, the CEO notices a guy leaning on a wall. The room is full of workers and he wants to let him know he means business. The CEO walks up to the guy and asks, "How much money do you make a week?" Undaunted, the young fellow looks at him and replies, "I make $200 a week." The CEO hands the guy $200 in cash and screams, "Here's a week's pay, now get out!" Feeling pretty good about his first firing, the CEO looks around the room. Then, to his astonishment, he sees a handful of guys walking out of the room. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" "We're quitting. We want to deliver pizza like that other guy." A Japanese and a Frenchman were arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The prison officer said to the two terribly disappointed-looking men, "Tell you what, I'll grant you just one special request each decade. So, what do you want for the first decade?" The Japanese asked for 1,000 books. The Frenchman asked for 1,000 bottles of wine. 10 years later, the prison officer asked what they wanted for the next decade. The Japanese ordered another 1,000 books. The Frenchman asked for a bottle opener. It was well known that there was this magical lake that had one place where you could scream your favorite thing and it would fill up the lake as you jumped in. An international group of friends went there to test it out. The German jumped in shouting beer and the lake was full of beer. The Frenchman jumped in shouting wine and the lake was filled with wine. The Japanese jumped in shouting sake and the lake was filled with sake. After thinking about it, the Belgian seemed to have finally decided and ran towards the lake. However, he stumbled upon a stone on the way and fell into the lake shouting shh. It's common for Japanese to laugh 3 times at one joke. The first time when they hear a joke. The second time when taught the meaning of the punchline. The third time when they get home and understand the punchline. Jack tells his shrink, "Last night I dreamt you were my mother." "How did you feel about it after you woke up?" asks the psychiatrist. "I overslept," answers Jack. "Then I remembered I had an appointment with you, so I grabbed a Coke and some cookies for breakfast and came right over. I didn't really have time to think about it. What does it mean, Doc?" "A Coke and some cookies?" says the psychiatrist. "You call that breakfast?" The assistant curator of the museum came to the head curator with a couple of problems. "Sir, the mummy is damp and getting moldy, and the white mouse in the maze exhibit is developing dry skin." The head curator thought for a minute, then advised, "Just put your mummy where your mouse is." Did you hear about the 2 similar-looking dogs? One was called Spot, and the other one was called Spot the Difference. A new supermarket opened near my house. It has an automatic water mister to keep the produce fresh. Just before it goes on, you hear the sound of distant thunder, and there's a smell of fresh rain. When you approach the milk cases, you hear cows mooing and experience a scent of fresh hay. When you approach the egg cases, you hear hens cluck and cackle, and the air is filled with the pleasing aroma of bacon and eggs frying. The veggie department features the smell of fresh buttered corn. Though I do have to say, I don't buy my toilet paper there. The new librarian decided that instead of checking out children's books by writing the names of borrowers on the book card herself, she would have the youngsters sign their own names. She would then tell them they were signing a contract for returning the books on time. Her first customer was a 2nd grader who looked surprised to see a new librarian. He brought 4 books to the desk and shoved them across to the librarian, giving her his name as he did so. The librarian pushed the books back and told him to sign them out. The boy laboriously printed his name on each book card and then handed them to her with a look of utter disgust. Before the librarian could even start her speech, he said scornfully, "That other librarian we had could write,